So, much like we did with the Black Priests video, we're going to take this video to explain the Builders, yet another group that was a part of Jonathan Hickman's Collapse of the Multiverse and Avengers and New Avengers, going into Secret Wars 2015, which will include Abyss, alongside the Alephs and basically the Ex Nihili. I know it sounds kind of crazy. Bear with me here. So while we don't really see the Builders truly until we get to Infinity issue number 1, the Builders were actually alluded to long before that, specifically in Avengers Volume 5, issue number 2. And the way this had played out was that Earth was essentially under attack, for lack of a better word, from Ex Nihilo and Abyss alongside an Aleph. And where we didn't truly know what they were or what was going on, issue number 2 explains all of this, when the Avengers basically show up to confront Ex Nihilo and Abyss and get the hell beat out of them, right? You know, Captain America ends up going back to activate the Wake the World command, which essentially brings in pretty much all the world's most premier superheroes outside of the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, and essentially forms Avengers World, where they ultimately go on a rescue mission for Thor and those guys. Issue number 2 has Ex Nihilo explaining to Thor the nature of the Builders, and he says, at the dawn of everything were the Builders. They were the first race, the oldest living things in the cosmos. They were a perfect people, and for a great while, they worshipped the goddess, the Mother Maker herself, the universe. Eventually, they grew beyond this, abandoning the old ways of reverence for the new path of relevance. As expansion and evolution occurred, the Builders created aggressive systems to direct, shape, and control the very structure of space and time. The first of these systems were gardeners, Alephs, sent out into the wild to purge species unfit and unsuitable for their new universe. For hundreds of millions of years, our Aleph raised world after world, all of which he deemed unfit for progress, until one day he encountered a species he considered worthy of preservation. He found them worthy of evolution. Then the gardener released the garden he carried within him for all that time. No two seeds an Aleph carries are the same. The Builders, in all their wisdom, knew that creation was chaos and fully embraced this inconsistent constant. This Aleph, our Aleph, yielded myself, Ex Nihilo, and my sister, Abyss. And from that day forward, whenever we hear the call of a living wild world, we either break it or attempt to transform the base species we find there into magnificent, more transcendent creatures. Now, there's a couple of things to understand about this, because the nature of the Builders as they were introduced by Hickman actually led to a lot of people getting their wires crossed, including me, right? My initial thought was that Jonathan Hickman was effectively rewriting the origin of creation throughout the entirety of the universe and potentially even the multiverse. That's not necessarily the case. The origin of universes themselves, even the multiverse, has varying origins that have existed over the years. There's some origins that say the Beyonders were responsible for it. There are others that say that the Celestials created everything. More recently, the explanation came from Al Ewing in his Ultimates run and Defenders Beyond runs, where basically it was the first firmament, the first universe. It was destroyed during a war between the Celestials and then ultimately shattered into a handful of pieces, becoming the first multiverse. And then by whatever manner and whatever means, universes died, multiverses died, they were reborn, and the cycle kind of continues on. What Jonathan Hickman was building here was simply saying, by the time the Builders arrived on the scene, they started emerging, life had already existed across the cosmos, right? Life was already evolving across the cosmos. They were just the first sentient race to come into existence. And so one of the things to know is that when Hickman uses a lot of this verbose and grandiose language, right? Mastering space and time and things like that, oftentimes those are metaphors for things. For example, when it talks about the Builders worshiping the Mother Maker, the universe, what they're actually talking about is Captain Universe. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, if you remember the quantum realm in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, within Marvel Comics, that's the microverse. And the microverse is permeated by a source of energy called the Enigma Force. It doesn't always manifest in individual beings, and it only really does that in times of great crisis. But when it does, the individual who is imbued with the power of the Enigma Force becomes Captain Universe. And at that point in time, Captain Universe was seemingly the most powerful being in existence. Now, of course, as you can imagine, once mutants started to evolve on Earth, and we ended up with guys like Franklin Richards, Matthew Malloy, the Marquis of Death from an alternate reality, the balance balance of power started shifting very, very fast. Not in the way that it did with The Rock in the DC Cinematic Universe, where he killed the whole franchise, but in the sense that these individuals were just really, really powerful, and more powerful than individuals like Captain Universe. And so the other statement here, when there's statements like, controlling the very structure of space and time, it's less about the builders mastering time travel. That's not really what they were doing. Instead, it's this idea that if you can create a sentient race, and you can instill in that sentient race the idea that you are God, they will do whatever you tell them to, right? And they will come to believe you as God, and they will go out into the universe and perform deeds and terrible acts in your name. And so that's kind of what's being referred here, right? They could literally guide the evolution of the entire universe. Hence the reason why the Alephs started traveling around to other worlds that already had forms of sentient life and eradicated that sentient life, only to replace that sentient life with life that would basically worship the builders in some kind of an industrious fashion. And so following this, the next explanation that we get about Ex Nihilo and Abyss in terms of how the two of them work in tandem actually comes in Avengers Volume 5, issue number 20, as part of the Infinity event. Now again, we'll talk more about Infinity here in a second, but in issue number 20, there came a point where Abyss had basically been contacted by another being. She didn't quite know who they were, but it did pique her curiosity because there were apparently answers to various questions that Abyss had that only this individual could provide. And so there comes a point when Abyss basically talks with Ex Nihilo and says, we need to go see who this person is and see what answers they can provide. And so one of the things to know is that leading up to this moment in Jonathan Hickman's run of Avengers, we knew there was more than one Ex Nihili, but Ex Nihilo and Abyss did not know that. And so when the time comes where they meet up with these other Ex Nihili, it takes them by surprise. And that's kind of when you start to get the bigger picture of what was going on with the builders and what was going on with things like the superstructures. And so what ends up happening is that Abyss, when she arrives here and encounters the other Ex Nihili, they actually start to kind of approach her with a sort of reverence. My God, she's real. There's no way she was real. We didn't believe that she was real. And so they ask Ex Nihilo the question, right? How is this possible? How does your Abyss yet live? And Ex Nihilo is kind of flabbergasted, right? He says, I don't understand what you mean. An Aleph contains two eggs, one light, one dark, one day, one night. I am Ex Nihilo. She is Abyss. We are as we have always been, two, not one. And that's where Ex Nihilo is told, we have not been that way for a very long time. All of our Abyssi died mysteriously thousands and thousands of years ago. I have to know, what makes the two of you so special? And all Ex Nihilo says is, I create life, right? She judges the work. How did your Abyssi die? And that's where Abyss chimes in after kind of understanding the full totality of the situation. And she says, the builders made them stop seeding worlds. Who am I without you? And what are you, if not life-giving? And so that's where the other Ex Nihili chime in and they say, when the new universal superstructure was created, we were all recalled and forbidden from harvesting worlds. No more gardens. And so Ex Nihilo in turn, with hearing this, says, and instead of creating life, you are relegated to being at best body servants for those that made us, or at worst, killers of worlds. Well, no more. Now, here's a couple things to pull away from this, right? And contextually, we were given this information really within like Avengers Volume 5, issue number 1. But Ex Nihilo and Abyss kind of work in tandem. Ex Nihilo has the ability to evolve life. And in fact, there comes a point in Hickman's run when he starts hitting Earth with what are called evolution bombs, which are designed to literally evolve the very planet itself, which in turn will evolve all forms of sentient life on Earth, including humans, or else it'll wipe them out. Abyss is the other side. Abyss judges the work, and if the work is deemed to be some kind of a failure, she destroys it, and then Ex Nihilo starts over. And so what the builders started doing was constructing something called superstructures. What was the point of superstructures? Okay, to understand that, we kind of have to sidetrack Hickman's Avengers, the New Avengers for a second, and talk about something called New Universe and New Universal. Basically, these were brands that were launched by Jim Shooter back in the 1980s. It was a catastrophic failure, and then it was reinvented by Marvel in the mid-2000s under Warren Ellis, which wasn't nearly as bad, but it still didn't really succeed as well as Marvel had hoped. The idea behind this, though, was that within these alternate realities, there weren't really any traditional superheroes. There was no Incredible Hulk, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man. It was literally a universe where time passed in real time. It was a universe where they were basically just real people who were suddenly imbued with abilities from something called the White Event. So in a lot of ways, it was Marvel's Ultimate Universe before Marvel's Ultimate Universe. Now, the White Event is actually the part that we really want to focus on here, because what Jonathan Hickman did is he took the concept of the White Event, along with the introduction of characters like Nightmask and Starbrand, and he rolled it all over into his Avengers New Avengers run, and then modified it. And so what he did is he established that when these superstructures were created by the builders, the intention was for there to be one superstructure for each universe. And what that superstructure would do is it would just monitor the universe, right, by a curator and a caretaker, two subtypes of the builder race. And when a time came where some sentient race in that universe, it wasn't always Earth and it wasn't always humans, but when the time came that some sentient race seemed to indicate that it was prepared for the next stage of evolution and worthy of the builder's gifts, that superstation would fire off a White Event. And what it would do is it would turn some member of that race into a Nightmask. What that means is that individual would now have a hyper advanced understanding of technology, for example, and they could start leading that sentient race into a more kind of technological advanced society, right? A utopia of sorts. And there were other modifications that came along the way. But the bigger thing here was that because this gift and these advancements would likely make this sentient race a target of other races, that sentient race would need some kind of a defense for itself, some defense system. And that's where the Starbrand came into play, because when this White Event was initiated, some individual would be imbued with the power of the Starbrand. And all that really means is that they would have enough power to overcome whatever force they were going up against, and then that power would just sort of neutralize again. So say, for example, that Starbrand were to face off against Captain America, right? Starbrand would basically be imbued with, incredible strength and speed and agility, but just enough to be able to beat Captain America. But then if suddenly Galactus showed up to that planet and wanted to consume it, that the Starbrand would suddenly have enough power to be able to defeat and potentially even destroy Galactus. And so it would just kind of shift on whatever the narrative was. It was very much a MacGuffin, but again, that was the nature of the Starbrand's powers. As far as how all this ties into the incursions, when the multiversal collapse was underway, right, literally the multiverse falling apart at the seams due to the incursions, a lot of these superstructures were being destroyed. And so what the builders did is they ordered all these superstructures to start firing off indiscriminately into their universes, hoping that whatever sentient planet they hit that was imbued with these powers would use those powers to bring an end to the incursions. And it didn't necessarily work 100% of the time. And that led into the events of Infinity. Now, when Infinity kicks off, it's important to understand Hickman was telling two stories at the same time. The first one was Thanos trying to find his son. We're not going to focus on that. The second one was the Builder War, and the Builder War actually took place out in space. When Infinity first kicks off, there comes a point where Captain Universe travels to meet with the Avengers and tells them, you don't know anything about the builders. All you know is just what you've been told, but you've never encountered a builder before. So you should really go and recruit Nihilo and Abyss. Bring them onto your team alongside their LF, and they can basically feed you all the information that you need in order to find some way to defeat the builders. But the Builder War was a catastrophic war because the builders were hyper advanced. They were incredibly powerful, so much so that worlds like Galador, where you had the Space Knights were incredibly capable. They had defended their world against virtually any number of threats. They were eradicated within minutes, and it was just like that, world after world after world after world. In fact, there's a really, really cool Silver Surfer tie-in. It is a Marvel Infinity comic, so a digital comic book, but Alephs show up to a Skrull world and just start raising the place. And the Silver Surfer comes out of nowhere after having this amazing monologue and basically tries to save as many people as he can. But that's kind of how the path follows with the builders. The funny thing about this is that other races across the universe were basically coming to realize the threat of the builders around the same time. For example, there are a handful of aliens that look to be launching an attack against the Shi'ar Empire. There comes a point where the Shi'ar Empire essentially neutralizes that threat, but that's when Gladiator, the leader of the Shi'ar Empire, is told they were actually fleeing from someone. We don't know who that is. And so by the time the Builder War is in full swing, it's basically Captain America leading the various empires of the world against the builders. So we're talking about the Badoon, the Shi'ar, the Skrull, the Kree. all these empires unified against the builders. And in fact, for the most part, the superheroes start to lose, right? They're actually getting completely and totally overrun, and there's seemingly no way they can win. There are a couple of really cool moments in that story. For example, there is an instance where Thor is brought forward as a kind of negotiating factor with one of the builders. And there's an exchange between the two of them. But at the very beginning of that negotiation, Thor throws his hammer out of the planet. The builder doesn't really know what it is, so he doesn't really give any thought to it. The hammer literally flies into space and then goes into the local sun and then comes back. And where the builder basically tells Thor, there's nothing you can do. We will destroy the entirety of your race, and then we will head to your Earth and we will wipe it out. That the hammer comes crashing back down and punches a hole in the builder. It's amazing, right? It's one of the coolest moments in the entirety of Infinity. You ask any comic book fan, what's the one moment from Infinity they love? And they will tell you it is that moment. It's absolutely amazing. There is another instance where the forces of the universe are actually driven to unleash the Annihilation Wave. And if you don't know what that means, there was a story written in the mid-2000s by a guy named Dan Abnett called Annihilation. And essentially, the villain Annihilus from the Negative Zone, with his army of like 1 trillion bugs, invaded into the main Marvel universe. And by the time the story picks up, Galactus has been captured, the Silver Surfer has been defeated, and the universe is on the brink of complete and total destruction. It's only when Galactus is freed and he wipes out 2/3 of the Annihilation Wave that basically the tide turns and the spacefaring empires start to win. Well, what ends up happening is that in a moment of desperation during Infinity, Captain America orders the release of the Annihilation Wave, and the builders completely eradicated. In fact, the only reason the builders were even defeated was due to the return of Captain Universe. And that's where you kind of learned what the motivation of the builders were in launching an attack against the universe in the first place and explicitly wanting to destroy Earth. It was the incursions. The builders had learned somewhere along the line that incursions were happening across the multiverse, and Earth was the incursion point. For those of you guys who are familiar with this, bear with me for a second while I explain this to the people who are not. The long and short of this is that an incursion is the result of what happens when two universes crash into each other. There is a reason for why that happens. We'll explain that in the video where we explain Dr. Doom, Molecule Man, and the Black Swans. But the way this plays out is that at some point during a day, an Earth will just appear in the sky. From the time that Earth appears, a clock starts, and it's an 8-hour clock. When that clock reaches 0, if one or both of those Earths are not destroyed, they'll crash into each other and destroy their respective universes. And so the builders traveling across the whole of creation and wiping out pretty much all these sentient races was done so that once they reach Earth and they destroy it, they can basically just kind of start rebuilding the universe from the ground up in their own image. But Captain Universe, fighting on behalf of the Avengers and really looking at the builders as what she considered to be a lost race, who somehow fell from the path of valuing and revering life to becoming these conquerors, ultimately destroyed pretty much all the builders except for one. And that builder retreated back into the multiverse. And so this is when you go into Time Runs Out. Now, it is important to specify here, and we mentioned this during our video on the Black Priest, Time Runs Out is a pivotal moment within Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. The reason being because up until Time Runs Out, it was basically various groups coming to understand the nature of the incursions and trying to find their own ways to deal with the incursions. When Time Runs Out hits, it's the unification of all these groups going after the Ivory Kings, the White Lords of Wild Space, also known as the Beyonders, and realizing they're the main threat. And so what ends up happening here in Time Runs Out is you learn that at some point when the incursions were first discovered by the Illuminati, Reed Richards, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, and those guys, they sent Hank Pym into the multiverse in the hopes that Hank Pym could find the source of the incursions. When Hank Pym returns, he kind of explains everything he saw. And one of the things he talks about is the builders. He says there comes a point when he basically discovered the remnants of a builder fleet after having suffered a catastrophic defeat. And the implication seems to be that the builders were not simply defeated in the main Marvel universe. The builders had actually launched this attack across multiple universes. And where in some universes they may have been successful, in others they were all but eradicated. And so the builder fleet, just kind of limping along, had gotten a hold of a map maker. Now, the importance of a map maker will basically be explained when we talk about the Beyonders and their group's involvement, right? So the Beyonders, map makers, Sidera Maris. But the long and short of this is that when the builders took this map maker, they realized that a signal was being broadcast from somewhere, and they were only able to detect it because of the map maker. And so they followed that signal to its origin point. And when they got there, they were eradicated. They were completely and totally obliterated. And probably one of the greatest moments in the entirety of Marvel's Avengers and New Avengers run, which we'll talk about once we get to our video where we explain the Beyonders, because it was incredible. Having said that, if what you're interested in is a kind of beginning to end explanation of Hickman's story, we do have that video. It's about 30 minutes long. It's far more condensed down. But if what you want is a more grandiose explanation, right, the full totality of Hickman's run, every story arc, the whole 9 yards, that video I think is something like 9 hours, and you'll find it on the Comics Explained Full Stories channel, which I'll link that down in the description. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully this answered your question. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.